Now, we've seen the effects in South Africa. The global drug trade is becoming more sophisticated, more intricate, presenting greater challenges for law enforcement. And South Africa is becoming a popular market and transit point for narcotics. Representatives of nearly 200 Interpol member states are in Cape Town at the moment, thrashing out plans and sharing knowledge. The head of the Hawks' Serious Organised Crime Unit, Brigadier Ebrahim Kadwa, joins us now from our studios in Cape Town for more on that illicit substances trafficking conference, as it's called. Brigadier, thank you. This is very topical. We've seen violence started recently by claims around foreign nationals and drugs. Was our specific situation spoken about?
Well, in this conference, what we basically had was to discuss the key trends and developments relating to the global illicit drug trade. And certainly we looked at various aspects, such as the various forms of trafficking from air to maritime, as well as land trafficking routes. We look at the role of transnational criminal networks and gangs. And as you know, in certain parts of the world, especially in Latin and Central America, gangs is also quite a prevalent problem. And there we've also understood the violence relating to gangs and drugs and the entire nexus. So surely the problems relating to drugs, gangs and violence is not unique to South Africa. It is in different parts of the globe. So these were amongst the topics that were discussed, and we were able to see and benchmark how we are able to better respond to the threats relating to transnational crime, gangs, and related activities.
Yeah. Tell us more about the trends. How is drug dealing changing, I guess, and what does South Africa specifically have to think about?
Well, in terms of narcotics, naturally we are dealing with a very dynamic situation. There is a high level of diversity and intensity in terms of the availability of drugs. And as you know, most of the drugs that we have in South Africa are normally imported into South Africa from different regions of the world. Cocaine coming in from Latin America. We're getting in heroin coming in from the Asian region, mainly from Afghanistan. And then it is flowing through the Indian Ocean, what is commonly referred to as the southern route, and then it comes into East and Southern Africa and then comes through our land borders. And then in South Africa itself, we also have a fair share of domestic drug production with drugs such as crystal methamphetamine, or TEC as it is more commonly known on the streets. We also have methadone, which is very much a unique drug to South Africa. But what is important is the illicit drug trafficking flows are very diverse, using air, maritime routes, as well as some new ways. For example, on the Indian Ocean, there is a new drug superhighway, the southern route, where Arab dhows are being utilized as a preferred mode of transport. So these were some of the important lessons we learned this week. We also looked at the very sophisticated techniques and concealment methods used by syndicates to basically smuggle the drugs. For example, we have seen case studies where drugs were concealed in pineapples, drugs were concealed in rocks, in actual rocks, purpose-built for these concealment methods. So it shows you how ingenious these drug trafficking networks that we are contending with. And that is why it is so important for the global drug enforcement fraternity to have converged and be able to ensure that we can share and that we can empower one another. And then more importantly is to be able to develop ways of better operational cooperation.
Yeah. You're talking about drugs. Let's talk about the transits through South Africa, up into Africa. Are we increasingly becoming that thoroughfare, and why?
Well, the drug trafficking networks are very dynamic, and they basically would exploit various regions of the world. So I think it's very important to indicate that we are not unique as a transshipment center. Naturally, South Africa, if you look at our geographic position, certainly we are basically dissecting the west and east of the world, and certainly there are well-established shipping routes. We are certainly well connected in terms of air trafficking routes. So certainly in that way we are going to find that trafficking networks would want to transship drugs through South Africa as well as the region. But may I also put it on record that we need to basically collapse this issue of just understanding countries as transshipment centers. What you are increasingly finding even in neighboring African countries is more and more countries that where transshipment areas are becoming consumption markets and significant consumption markets. So we're basically finding that we are collapsing this issue of just being categorized as a transshipment center. We are finding interconnected dynamics at work here.
Yeah, and of course we are a big market. I want to talk about that, but first the drugs coming in. I remember a certain flight from South America, again and again, drug mules were found on that flight. You said now it's become very diverse, drugs coming in from all different directions. Why are we not catching the drugs? Is it a matter of resources or intelligence, not knowing exactly where they're landing, or these drug traffickers just becoming incredibly clever?
I think in terms of South Africa, we have been very effective in responding to drug trafficking networks. If you look at just this year, whether it be at OR Tambo International Airport as well as our other airports, we are arresting drug couriers or mules, as you have referred to them, on a regular basis. In fact, on a daily basis, we are arresting them. And most of these arrests are based on the intensifying of operations, the improvement of our intelligence capabilities to be able to identify the organizers as well as the trafficker, as well as the mules that they have been sending. So that is a good example of how effective we have been working at airports. Then if you look at the maritime routes, you will remember that at the beginning of the year, we intercepted 700 kilograms of cocaine that arrived at Port Elizabeth Harbor from Santos in Brazil. 2 weeks ago, we have intercepted around 85 kilograms of cocaine that has arrived from Ecuador. So all of this is through improving our intelligence-led operations, working more collaboratively at a national level, leveraging all our capabilities. So all of this is paying dividends in the way we are able to detect drugs. And more importantly, in terms of domestic production, on a weekly basis, we are able to identify and dismantle industrial laboratories that are producing producing mandrakes on our shores. So this all demonstrates that from a law enforcement perspective, we are sharpening our game. But yes, there is still room for much more improvement. We cannot be complacent because we have to ensure that we are continuously going to improve our capabilities at an operational level to target and better prosecute drug trafficking networks.
You mentioned tick, which is one of the most insidious, disgusting drugs. It eats part of your brain, your anatomy. We know that's on the rise. Is that mostly manufactured in South Africa, sort of the chemical drugs? And just tell us what sort of drugs are increasingly being used.
Well, I think as far as tick is concerned, we know over the last decade, it has been ravaging many communities, especially in the Western Cape, and then it has spread. Whilst we have been able to identify and dismantle many domestic clandestine laboratories, it is important for me to illustrate that in terms of the actual markets and the more significant markets for tick, it is more in Asia and more particularly Southeast Asia. And in terms of production, we have found that West Africa is now a major production area for crystal meth, or tick as it is known, in Mexico, In parts of Asia, there is massive industrial scale production of teak. And this teak is then naturally sent to different markets of the world. But as I said, the biggest market for teak is in Southeast Asia. So that is where most of the global production will be destined for.
And if you're saying parts of Africa being used more and more for production, I mean, can you comment on the recent violence and what happened? Taxi drivers saying they needed to take the law into their own hand because foreign nationals were responsible for a lot of the drug dealing. Can you comment on that and their claim as well that the police are often involved? So even if you're taking away the drugs, sometimes the police aren't disposing of that, but selling it on.
Well, I think as far as the actors and the traffickers that are involved in the drug trade, we have both South Africans as well as foreign nationals involved. I think what is important for us in the police and in the broader law enforcement community is to really target those that are involved, irrespective from wherever they come, because we have to ensure safer communities. We have to ensure that we can be able to deal with the threat and mitigate this more effectively. So in terms of the people involved, we have to deal with them. I can assure you the issues of violence are no comparison with other parts of the world, as we have learned in the conference. The cartels in Mexico and Central America, the gangs are also very, very gruesome in terms of the violence. So unfortunately, around the world, you will find that with organized crime, with drug trafficking, that violence and gangs are synonymous, you are going to get. So these are things that law enforcement around the world is dealing with, and we also have to ensure that we are able to intensify. And as you have seen, that whilst we have seen an increase in gang-related activities across the country, the South African Police Service, the government, has been making investments. We have recently established the anti-gang unit. We have deployed the South African National Defence Force. We are increasing our ground coverage in terms of intelligence, in terms of law enforcement, in terms of all our capabilities to be able to deal with this threat. So I think what is important is, as the police, we are responsive and we are ensuring that we are bringing much more safer communities in South Africa.
And finally, despite all of that, though, I think there's a sense that drug abuse is on the rise. Can you confirm that and tell us sort of how that increase is playing out in South Africa?
Well, the South African drug landscape certainly sees a cocktail of drugs. Certainly we have diverse drugs. It's not only cannabis. We are increasingly seeing nyope, which we know again is ravaging communities, especially hitting the poorest of the poor areas. We are seeing new psychoactive substances or designer drugs, as they are more colloquially known, such as spice. These are synthetic drugs that mimic cannabis. They mimic other drugs, but so in that respect, again, South Africa, we have improved our legislation to be able to arrest and prosecute those that are involved in the production and dealing in these designer drugs. But really, I can tell you that South Africa's drug problem, whilst it is of concern, there are far more critical drug centers around the world in terms of production, in terms of consumption. As you know, for example, in the United States, they have an opioids crisis where there are far more lethal drugs that are killing people by the hour. So these are problems that are not unique to South Africa, but what is most important is being vigilant, is being responsive, and to ensure that we work collaboratively with communities, to ensure that law enforcement and the government basically works more and more jointly in being able to address. This is not a law enforcement problem. This is something that has to involve prevention. We have to improve treatment. We have to ensure that we can be able to go to schools, we can go to communities and create better awareness relating to narcotics. So all of this requires a great amount of work in South Africa, and I think that effort is being given, as you have heard the President, our Minister, referring to this, and the Central Drugs Authority, the National Drug Master Plan are all bringing us to account so that we can be able to ensure more safer and more safer communities.
All right, thank you very much. So South African officials are hoping to learn more from other Interpol members fighting drugs around the world. That was Brigadier Ebrahim Kadwa, head of the Hawks' Serious Organised Crime Unit. We take a short break.